The storm brews a sudden shift in trade dynamics. In the summer of 2025, a shift in the balance of power between the United States and Canada seemed inevitable. The U.S. imposed a surprising increase in tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, sparking debates among economists and policymakers alike. The initial decision came in early June when President Donald Trump, under the authority of Section 232 of the U.S. Trade Expansion Act, signed an order doubling tariffs on Canadian steel imports from 25% to a staggering 50%. The U.S. administration justified this move as a national security measure aimed at protecting American manufacturers from what it perceived as a surge of low-cost steel flooding the market from countries with surplus production capacity. The intended result was clear: bolster U.S. industries while simultaneously fortifying the nation's defense capabilities by ensuring the steel sector was both healthy and competitive. However, the reality was far more complex. The decision triggered a wave of unintended consequences, particularly for the Canadian economy. As the new tariffs hit, Canadian steel became substantially less competitive in the U.S. market. The repercussions were felt not only by businesses but also by everyday workers in manufacturing hubs. The Canadian Steel Producers Association quickly warned that some mills would likely be forced to cut their capacity or even shut down, leading to potential job losses in communities that relied heavily on the steel industry. In response, Ottawa was quick to act, implementing defensive measures aimed at shielding its own market from the fallout. Quotas on steel imports from non-free trade agreement (FTA) countries were slashed by 50%, and excess imports were subject to punitive tariffs. While no outright export ban was declared, Canada's strategic shift toward protecting its domestic steel supply raised concerns in the U.S., where manufacturers feared a shortage of critical materials. To add fuel to the fire, Ontario introduced an electricity surcharge on power exports to the U.S., a move that further strained relations between the two neighbors. By August, tensions had escalated further as Canada unveiled new import control measures, specifically targeting steel from non-FTA nations. The policy restricted imports of hot-rolled steel, cold-rolled steel, and specialty steel products, which were crucial to the automotive and construction sectors. U.S. manufacturers, already grappling with the uncertainty of fluctuating tariffs, now found themselves facing even higher costs for essential materials. The result was a ripple effect that touched everything from construction projects to the automotive assembly line. In the midst of these shifting trade policies, Ford Motor Company, a cornerstone of American industry, found itself at a crossroads. The company, with its deep ties to both the U.S. and Canadian manufacturing landscapes, had to reassess its strategy. The looming tariffs on steel, aluminum, and potentially even vehicles had the potential to disrupt Ford's entire supply chain. Instead of confronting these challenges head-on, Ford opted for a more subtle yet highly strategic response. It turned its eyes northward. Ford made the calculated decision to move more of its vehicle production to Canada, where the uncertainty surrounding U.S. tariffs and trade policies could be avoided or mitigated. Ford's move wasn't just a temporary fix to avoid tariffs, it was a strategic realignment. In a shift that surprised many, the iconic American carmaker began routing its vehicles from Mexico to Canada using bonded transport carriers, a method that allowed vehicles to pass through U.S. territory without incurring tariffs. This maneuver alone reportedly saved Ford nearly $1 billion in potential tariff-related losses in 2025, demonstrating the extent to which tariff policies were pushing companies to rethink their manufacturing and logistics strategies. Canada's industrial landscape, long considered a quiet supporter of U.S. operations, was now experiencing a quiet renaissance. Once struggling plants in Ontario and Quebec were showing signs of renewed activity. Ford's investment in its Oakville assembly complex was just the beginning. The company's decision to convert the facility into an electric vehicle plant was seen as a sign of hope for both the industry and the local workforce. What had once been a site of layoffs and uncertainty was now buzzing with new opportunities. But the economic dynamics were far from settled. Ford's pivot to Canada had serious implications for both U.S. and Canadian workers. While Canada appeared to be benefiting from the influx of investment, workers in key U.S. manufacturing states such as Ohio and Michigan found themselves increasingly sidelined. Plants that had long relied on Canadian steel were now shutting down or cutting back on production due to the rising cost of imports. For workers who had spent their entire lives in steel mills, the situation was frustrating and disheartening. As one veteran steelworker in Pittsburgh put it, if we're still shutting down, who exactly is being protected? Amid the backdrop of rising steel prices, dwindling jobs, and supply chain disruptions, Canada's shift toward becoming an industrial hub was gaining momentum. The question remained, though, was this shift merely a temporary maneuver, or was it the beginning of a fundamental change in the North American production landscape? As workers on both sides of the border faced increasingly uncertain futures, the answer seemed less clear than ever. Ford's strategic shift, a glimpse into Canada's industrial future. As Ford Motor Company strengthened its presence in Canada, the broader implications of this move were beginning to take shape. The company's decision was not only a tactical retreat from the looming U.S. tariffs, but also part of a larger long-term restructuring of the North American manufacturing map. What was once seen as an overflow for U.S. production is now gradually emerging as a strategic industrial center in its own right. The shift was not limited to Ford alone. By the summer of 2025, Canada's industrial infrastructure began to see unprecedented levels of investment, especially in Ontario and Quebec. Ford's Oakville Assembly Complex project, initially planned as a hub for electric vehicle production, was revised to focus on gas-powered Super Duty trucks, signaling that even in the age of electrification, the demand for internal combustion vehicles remained significant. The change was likely due to the uncertainty in U.S. policy surrounding electric vehicle, EV incentives and tariffs, a sector in which the U.S. has yet to find its footing. For the residents of Oakville, the change was more than just a corporate decision. It was a lifeline. Engineers and workers who had been laid off during the post-pandemic downturn were now seeing hope for the first time in years. For many, this shift was symbolic of a revival, a sign that the industrial landscape, which had long supported families and communities, might yet be on the cusp of revival. For the first time in 5 years, I have a reason to get up early again, shared one of the engineers in a local meeting, his voice full of optimism. Ford's investments in Canada were not restricted to Oakville alone. Across the border in Quebec, Ford, in partnership with Korean companies EcoBM and Scon, began developing one of North America's most advanced cathode material plants. This $1.2 billion project aimed to produce 45,000 metric tons of cathode material annually, a critical component in the production of electric vehicle batteries. The plant was set to become a cornerstone of Canada's clean energy sector, demonstrating the country's push to move beyond its traditional industries and into emerging fields like EV technology and advanced battery production. Yet it wasn't just Ford leading the charge. The Canadian government played a pivotal role in shaping this transformation. With over $644 million in federal and provincial support, the Canadian government sent a clear message to multinational corporations. Canada was ready to be more than just a passive participant in the global industrial supply chain. The investment was not merely financial, but also strategic. Canada was staking its claim as a leader in the clean energy supply chain, an area in which it hoped to outpace its southern neighbor. As Quebec and Ontario turned their attention to new technologies, older Canadian industrial towns also began to experience a resurgence. In Windsor, a city long known for its automotive industry, Ford committed more than $600 million to modernize the Windsor engine plant. This was not just about machinery upgrades, it represented nearly 800 new jobs and a chance for the city to reclaim its industrial pride. The decision to invest in the Windsor plant underscored the significance of preserving domestic production capacity, not just through investment in technology, but also in sustaining local manufacturing hubs. The impact of these investments extended far beyond the steel plants and automotive factories. The ripple effects were being felt in communities across Canada. In small towns like Boncourt, once known for their industrial output, workers were beginning to return to jobs that had once seemed a distant memory. For older Canadians, many of whom had witnessed the decline of the steel industry firsthand, this shift represented not just an economic recovery, but a preservation of their industrial identity. In this context, Ford's decision to invest heavily in Canada appeared to be a clear sign of the country's emerging role as a manufacturing powerhouse. However, it wasn't just the large corporations benefiting. Smaller manufacturers and suppliers also found themselves adjusting to this new landscape. In Windsor, for example, over 600 million Canadian dollars were committed to modernizing the engine plant, but these investments were also creating hundreds of new opportunities for small businesses. These businesses, once focused solely on supplying parts to the US, now found themselves thriving as part of Canada's broader push to rejuvenate its manufacturing sector. Meanwhile, in the US, the narrative was different. As Canada embraced its newfound role, the US continued to grapple with the consequences of its tariff policies. As manufacturers like Ford strategically moved north, US workers and manufacturers were left in a state of uncertainty. With American factories reliant on Canadian steel and aluminum, the soaring costs of these materials led many plants to halt production or scale back operations. In the steel towns of Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, once bustling factories were now eerily quiet, and workers who had spent decades in the industry found themselves facing layoffs, reduced hours, and mounting frustration. The situation was particularly dire for small and mid-sized manufacturers, many of which were unable to withstand the rising costs of steel. In Indiana, a steel frame workshop laid off 18 employees after losing a major contract due to a 32% rise in input costs. The company, once proud of its ability to deliver high-quality products, now found itself struggling to stay afloat. This squeeze on smaller manufacturers only exacerbated the growing sense of instability among workers and businesses alike. Even as larger corporations like Ford found ways to sidestep tariffs, smaller businesses were left to pick up the pieces. The increasing uncertainty surrounding the U.S. manufacturing sector raised an important question. Were the tariffs doing more harm than good? While the intent behind the tariffs was to protect American jobs and industries, the reality was that many workers were being left behind. As the global supply chain shifted northward, it seemed that American manufacturers and workers were caught in a race to adapt, while Canada quietly emerged as a more stable, strategic alternative. The unseen future, Canada's rise and the shift in North American industry. As the consequences of the 2025 tariffs continue to unfold, it is becoming increasingly clear that Canada's industrial landscape is undergoing a profound transformation. The country, once a secondary player in North America's manufacturing supply chain, is now emerging as a strategic hub for investment, innovation, and production. While the United States continues to grapple with policy uncertainty and economic disruption, Canada's steady rise signals a new phase in North American industrialization. This shift is not merely about jobs and capital. It is about the restructuring of North America's entire industrial value chain, one that may have profound implications for the future. In a way, Canada's emergence as a manufacturing powerhouse is a response to the volatility caused by U.S. tariff policies. As the tariffs on steel and aluminum surged, many corporations that had once relied heavily on the U.S. market for their supplies began to shift operations northward. This move was not just about avoiding tariffs, but about securing a more stable environment where long-term planning was possible. Canada's policy consistency, its transparent approach to government support, and its position within the USMCA framework have made it an increasingly attractive destination for multinational corporations. Take, for example, Ford's expanding presence in Canada. While the company's decision to invest heavily in Quebec and Ontario may have initially been driven by tariff avoidance, it has since become clear that these moves are part of a broader strategy to establish Canada as a central node in Ford's North American operations. The Oakville Assembly Complex, once slated for conversion into an electric vehicle plant, now focuses on producing gas-powered Super Duty trucks, a decision that on the surface might seem counterintuitive in the age of electrification. However, this pivot reflects the uncertainty surrounding U.S. EV policies and tariffs, and Ford's need to hedge against potential instability in the U.S. market. Moreover, Ford's cathode material plant in Quebec, a partnership with EcoBM and Scon, is just one example of how Canada is positioning itself at the forefront of clean energy and electric vehicle technology. This $1.2 billion project is designed to produce vital components for the electric vehicle supply chain, offering the country an opportunity to establish itself as a leader in this rapidly growing sector. Government support for this project, totaling over $644 million, highlights Canada's determination to build a robust, clean energy infrastructure that can compete with global leaders like China and the US. What is perhaps most striking about this shift is the way it's being felt on the ground. In cities like Windsor, once a symbol of North America's automotive industry, new investments are breathing life back into communities that had long been struggling. Ford's $600 million commitment to modernizing the Windsor engine plant not only preserves the town's industrial heritage but also creates nearly 800 new jobs. These investments, though primarily focused on large-scale projects, are also having a cascading effect on smaller businesses. In Windsor and other manufacturing hubs, suppliers, logistics companies, and service providers are benefiting from the increased demand created by Ford's growing operations. For the workers who once faced an uncertain future, these investments represent more than just jobs. They represent hope. In Windsor, for instance, the modernization of the engine plant is a direct response to the loss of manufacturing jobs that had plagued the region in recent years. With the rise of electric vehicles and the push for clean energy, the Windsor plant is a key piece of Ford's long-term strategy to remain competitive in the global market. For workers who had previously seen their livelihoods vanish, the return of cranes and machinery symbolizes a new beginning, one that offers them a chance to rebuild their careers and communities. At the same time, the rise of Canada as a manufacturing hub is not just about traditional industries. The push toward electric vehicle technology, advanced materials, and battery production signals a deeper transformation in Canada's industrial identity. No longer content to simply be a supplier of raw materials or a back-office operation for U.S. companies, Canada is actively shaping its own future in the global manufacturing landscape. The focus on sectors like clean energy, battery production, and high-performance combustion engines is positioning Canada as a critical player in the next phase of industrialization, one that values sustainability, innovation, and long-term growth. The question now, however, is how sustainable this shift will be. While Canada's rise as an industrial powerhouse is undeniably impressive, it faces several challenges. The U.S. may continue to impose tariffs and trade barriers, making it difficult for Canadian manufacturers to maintain a competitive edge. Additionally, while government support has been crucial in driving investment, the country must continue to adapt its policies to ensure that it remains a favorable destination for global corporations. If these policies succeed, however, Canada could cement its role as the industrial heart of North America. The larger implications for the U.S. are undeniable. As production shifts northward, American workers and manufacturers are left to pick up the pieces. The steel towns of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, once the backbone of the U.S. manufacturing sector, are now facing an uncertain future. For many workers, the new tariff policies have led to job losses, reduced hours, and the collapse of industries that had once been seen as untouchable. While U.S. corporations like Ford have found ways to navigate the shifting policies, smaller manufacturers have been hit hard by the rising costs of steel and aluminum. In the face of these challenges, many are beginning to question whether the U.S. tariff policies are truly serving their intended purpose. The rise of Canada as a manufacturing hub, fueled by stability and government support, shows that protectionist measures may not always achieve the desired outcomes. If anything, these tariffs have spurred a re-evaluation of supply chain strategies, leading many global corporations to look beyond the U.S. for more reliable and cost-effective alternatives. At the heart of this transformation is the workers who are often caught in the crossfire of shifting trade policies. For many in the U.S., the tariffs have not led to job protection, but to job loss. Meanwhile, in Canada, workers are stepping into new roles as the country redefines its industrial identity. The question that remains is whether this transformation will lead to a permanent restructuring of North America's manufacturing landscape. Will Canada continue to rise, or will the U.S. eventually regain its footing as the region's industrial leader? As these questions linger, one thing remains clear. The future of North American manufacturing is being rewritten. Whether this transformation is temporary or permanent will depend on the decisions made in the coming years and the industries, workers, and governments that drive this change. The trade war, it seems, has only just begun to reveal its true impact.